It was a humid summer evening in the small town of San Pedro, New Mexico. The type of night where the air clings to the skin and the river nearby moves lazily, barely audible under the thick cover of trees. For generations, this sleepy town had been home to stories that mix the ordinary with the supernatural, an intertwining of reality and myth that defined life here. But nothing stood out quite like the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman, whose presence loomed over the town like a shadow no one could outrun. According to the most common version of the legend, La Llorona was once a beautiful woman named Maria. Much like her namesake in San Pedro, Maria lived in a village long ago, her beauty captivating all who saw her. She married a wealthy man, and together they had 2 children. But over time, her husband grew distant, and Maria's jealousy consumed her. One night, in a fit of rage and grief, she took her children to the river and drowned them, an act she would instantly regret. Realizing the horror of her actions, Maria threw herself into the river as well, seeking to reunite with her children in death. But instead of finding peace, she was cursed to wander the earth for eternity, searching for her lost children. Her cries for her children are said to be heard near rivers, lakes, or any place where water flows, a fitting punishment for the lives that she took. In this way, La Llorona became a symbol of grief, guilt, and punishment. She is forever searching, forever crying, trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow. Her presence a warning to those who might dare to ignore her tale. Maria Sanchez, a grandmother and lifelong resident, had always regarded the story with cautious reverence. She heard the warnings her abuela once whispered to her as a child. Never go near the river at night, niña. That's where La Llorona searches for her children. The words clung to her mind like a warning bell that never faded. Despite living next to the river for her entire life, Maria never dared to challenge the legend. She knew people who had, and their stories always ended in chills, warnings, or something worse. One night, as a heavy thunderstorm rolled in, Maria found herself recalling a particularly disturbing tale that had haunted her family for years. It was in the 1960s when Maria's uncle Pedro went missing for 2 days. He had gone fishing along the river as he often did, ignoring the old warnings, feeling invincible in his youth. He wasn't afraid of any ghost stories. After all, they were just that, stories. Pedro had fished late into the night, swatting mosquitoes and listening to the crickets, the steady hum of the river his only companion. But as the moon arose, something shifted in the air. Pedro later recounted to Maria that he had heard soft weeping coming from downstream. At first, it seemed like the sound was being carried by the wind. But as he listened, it grew louder, more distinct. He described it as the crying of a woman, desperate and heart-wrenching, calling out for her children. He knew the legend. Of course, everyone in San Pedro did, but he brushed it off, chalking the sound up to a tick of wind, or perhaps an owl. But as the night deepened, the crying didn't stop. He finally stood to leave when he noticed a figure barely visible in the distance, standing by the riverbank. It was a woman dressed in white, her hair blowing gently in the night air. Pedro called out, thinking she might be lost, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward him, her face pale and obscured by shadows. As she stepped closer, the air around Pedro grew icy. His heart began to pound, and without realizing it, he stumbled backward, his fishing gear forgotten. The weeping had stopped, but the figure kept advancing. When she was only a few feet away, he finally saw her face, or rather, the lack of one. Her features were hollow, sunken as if she had no eyes or any mouth, only the ghastly outline of a skull beneath her tattered veil. Pedro didn't wait to see more. He ran, sprinting back towards town, never daring to look back. When he reached home, drenched in sweat and trembling, he could barely explain what he had seen. All he could say was that La Llorona had appeared by the river, and her haunting cries still echoing in his ears. The tale of Pedro's encounter was just one of many that shaped the legend in San Pedro, a place where stories of the supernatural seemed to seep into every day. But the origin of La Llorona's story reached far beyond this small town. In 2010, La Llorona's legend resurfaced again in San Pedro when a local man named David Cortez had his own brush with the supernatural. David, a skeptic of most things paranormal, had been camping near the river with friends. It was a cool October night, and the group sat around a fire, sharing stories, laughing, and inevitably talking about La Llorona. As the night wore on, the others went to bed. But David stayed awake, staring out at the dark river. He thought he saw movement along the water's edge, a trick of the light, he assumed. But then the unmistakable sound of weeping reached his ears. At first he froze. His rational mind tried to dismiss it as the wind, the water, anything but the legend. But the crying grew louder, more desperate, and then he saw her. A woman in white, standing by the riverbank, her face obscured. David's heart raced. His legs felt heavy as if earth itself was holding him in place. The woman turned her head slowly. Her face failed, but the sense of dread that filled him was unmistakable. The air around him dropped to a biting cold, and suddenly, without thinking, he bolted back to the campsite. In the days that followed, David struggled to explain what he had seen. He had never believed in ghosts, in folklore, or in the idea that a legend like La Llorona could be real. But now he wasn't so sure. Today, the story of La Llorona continues to ripple through communities like San Pedro. Her tale is told to children, not just as a warning to stay away from the river, but as a reminder of the thin line between the world we know and the one that exists beyond our understanding. For those who have heard her cries or glimpsed her figure, the legend is not just a story. It's an undeniable reality. To this day, locals in San Pedro say that on certain nights, if you listen closely near the river, you can still hear her mournful wail carried by the wind. Whether a cautionary tale or a haunting truth, La Llorona remains forever tied to the waters, wandering the earth in search of what she can never reclaim.